everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Frank Moreno. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Entersekt, and I'm here with Carrie Forbes, the CEO of League Data. Carrie, thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So I know we'll have many of your credit unions check this out, but for anyone who isn't familiar with you or with League Data, you want to take a minute and just give them a quick overview?
For sure. So League Data, we are, I say an old fintech. We've been around actually since 1975. And essentially, we've been in the business of helping credit unions aggregate to have all of their enterprise technology, put out to practice. So if you imagine, it's very small financial institutions. It gets challenging to adopt technology, especially in great change. So ever since the 70s, we've been working with our credit unions to help identify the right solutions and also run them and be that expertise partner. So we're actually also their CIO. It's a very interesting kind of relationship that we have over the years. So yeah, and we're owned by our credit union. So we ourselves operate like a cooperative, which makes things a lot different than maybe in a traditional sort of, corporate environment. So
Excellent. Excellent. So we're here discussing financial fraud. Recently, our companies, League Data and Entersekt, decided to work together on a project to explore different ways to use different types of technology and solutions to fight a number of the fraud challenges that are facing our industry. And through that, we asked Carrie to come on and discuss that project a little bit. So to start, I figured we'd kind of kick things off and just talk about just the state of digital transformation amongst your credit unions. Before we even dive into the fraud stuff, how evolved would you say most of your credit unions are in 2024, and what's high on their priority list on the digital transformation side?
well, we are actually undergoing a significant change ourselves. So we are just about to launch our first credit union in the change of our core bank system. But it's bigger than it's actually quite a bit bigger than just core change. Although anybody that knows anything about that, that's a pretty big transformation in and of
Huge.
itself. But we're actually migrating from a traditional, say, legacy environment to a digital native core in the cloud. So it's a very different model, not just the technology, but it changes the way that we do things and it changes the business model. So the level of change that they're facing, and we've been doing this since the pandemic, so they've been going through all of the changes society has had with that on top, including what's happening in cybersecurity and fraud. So lots on the go for us. And I would say the level of it's mixed. Our level of understanding, because things are changing so quickly, I'd say is across our network, it's probably medium, but we have a lot of work to do to understand new threats. And also at the end of the day, our credit unions have to serve their membership. So it's a space that becomes really challenging and you're constantly running to catch up.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And we're seeing a lot of the same thing. So exciting times for you for sure. So the project with us, with Entersekt, we're looking at fraud attacks that are facing the industry. What are you hearing that some of the big concerns are amongst your credit unions currently?
You know, I would say first I'll start with some of the bread and butter ones that I think have continued to evolve but are still really significant.
Mhm.
Phishing attacks, a lot of identity theft, that's crucial. E-transfer fraud is really big, particularly in Canada because of our system that's national. Card fraud as well. And then as we get into digital solutions and verification and all of those, this is getting trickier as we go. So we hear a lot of those things. And now let's talk about, now we're hearing a lot of what's Gen AI going to do? What about
Mhm.
deep fakes? What about all of these new tools that again are just either enhancing or we're not even maybe aware of what their impacts are quite yet. So it's a whole other space that on top of, like I say, our traditional vectors, we're seeing a lot of concern about new things.
Yeah, same. So we see the impact of fraud hit a number of areas, right? Sometimes it's around decreased deposits, or maybe it's member retention issues. It trickles into the call center and you get higher call volumes. Are you seeing the same? Are there other impacts that you might be seeing as well?
Definitely a lot of concern. I think, one of the advantages that we have in our credit union system is we get to actually talk a lot to our actual members directly in different forums. So we hear directly from them stories of this happened to either my friend or my, I'm concerned about uh, our systems. Are we protected? Do we have the right things in place to deal with this? And I think the other concern for folks in the credit union, or say that are not in a very large bank environment, there's always a concern that, are we too small, or do we have enough, enough of that strength? So, when we look at, we're seeing those concerns direct, but we are noticing increases in our own kind of view on, we'll call it brute force attacks. We can see that that's become, and especially when they're tied to world events, you can kind of see those patterns emerge. We're seeing a lot more of the two-factor fraud coming in. So we've actually had to take some measures in some places where there's gaps to add extra heavy layers that aren't always good for convenience, but need to be there until the solutions get to a state where they're really going to make sure that we have that confidence. So it's a tough spot. And I think, the last we're seeing is card fraud, and a lot of what can happen when we've got digital cards in that space. So we're seeing a bigger impact on those.
Excellent. Yeah, and you read my mind with some of the questions I'm going to ask you. So I think we're right on the same page. So there's obviously multiple channels that credit unions need to protect their members. There's obviously digital, but there's also in branch, call center, payments, open banking. Let's talk a little bit about digital. Authentication, especially for us, is always an area of focus, and so many FIs depend on SMS, email, or SMS one-time passcodes. Are you seeing any issues around authentication, and are most of them still using one-time passcodes? And are there any position positive or negative on biometrics?
Well, there's a lot of good questions there, and I'm very opinionated on a lot of them. But I think, when we look at this space, and I've been kind of in the back end of this since we started launching internet banking. And over time, we always have this push and pull of fear versus convenience kind of pulling a lot of the chain. It's really messy because we have a little bit of a challenge where, on one hand, our members are very, very concerned about these things like Gen I, like I just mentioned. But yet there's a ton of pressure that the layers and layers of, I'll call these single-use passwords, that's really, it's becoming cumbersome. Or we may not have folks that have access to the right device at the right time in order to do it, and it just makes the whole experience wonky. So there's definitely this dichotomy of pressure pulling those two things across. Now, biometrics, I have a little concern, like we're getting to this point, and I'm seeing already, I think recently this week, there's tooling that can now read your thumbprint on screen by sound. Isn't that fascinating? Right? So we start to think about that. Well, once you have your biometric, you can't replace it, right? So we have to really think that through. And funny enough, I was on a government project years ago looking at authentication, and that was one of the scenarios that there was predicted longer term. What happens if that can happen? Then there's nearly there's no recourse for the user once that biometric is out there. So it's like this race, right, that we have to think about. So I think the problem, as well, as we've got user behavior in mind, thinking about, I think we tend to think in a desktop world sometimes, or in a multi-device world, and that's just not necessarily what's happening. And so how we're able to authenticate people, and let's face it, if we move into open banking, and in Canada that's coming as consumer directed finance, this is going to be critical to get right, or the whole integrity of how we exchange data is going to fall apart. So yeah, lots to say there, but I would say, and I those questions, all get back to the user, which is, it just needs to work. Yep. So there it all boils down, right?
Agreed. You kind of sticking on the authentication track for a minute, we see a lot of expansion of the need for authentication tools into the call center. So when you go beyond digital and you start having members call into the call center, and for years it was either knowledge-based authentication, what's your mother's maiden name, blah blah blah, or okay, we're going to send you a one-time passcode, which can then be captured by a man in the middle. Are you seeing the same thing? What's your kind of position on authentication in the call center?
Yeah, that's an area we're looking at newer, I'll call contact center solutions, not just for ourselves, but our constituents, and thinking
Mhm.
about that modernization. And I started out in the call center industry, so I'm shocked sometimes at how things have not progressed in certain areas,
Mhm.
and some of the practices that are recommended haven't evolved with it in some of those
Mhm.
cases. So we do see, and you hear now, I'm knocking on wood because none of my jurisdiction I've seen this, but you are seeing that many of the ways that, again, social engineering is still a huge, huge issue in terms of
Mhm.
security overall. And it is, I hate to say it, but humans, we're the most fallible part. We really are.
Mhm.
So a lot of the contact center practices, I think, are still thinking again about a more analog time when you're and and you're doing these practices. They're not thinking through, well, what if that voice on the phone, or what if this individual, who could they be? So that level of trust with that individual at the contact center, when that gets compromised, then we have a really big issue, and that seems to be where some of the bad actors are starting to go. And it's just the same. Again, if you get to know that person and build that trust, and it can take two or three. All it has to take is one or two follow-on calls, maybe
Mhm.
a piece of valid information. That person feels confident, and as long as they're adhering to all of the check marks, well, you're authenticated.
Yep.
And even in the old days, it was still very much a challenge, and there was a lot of hoops around it. We've tried to simplify it, but to replace what? So it is, I think, that in itself is going to continue to be anywhere we have human intervention, and we're going to have to think about, well, what about that channel?
Yeah, one of the areas that we've been exploring and we're seeing some early success is the integration of the digital banking or mobile banking app and the call center. So as opposed to having a series of knowledge-based questions to authenticate or sending an SMS OTP, actually sending a push notification from the call
Mhm.
center directly to the individual's mobile app. Now you've got that possession factor. So you're almost doing multi-factor in a way. So we're seeing some really good response in that area, and I'm sure that as the two companies work together and explore some ideas, that's going to come up. So I think there's opportunity there, no doubt. Um, so let's talk a little bit about what's at the top of headlines these days, and it's instant payments. Account-to-account
Mhm.
payments. The growth of fraud with Zelle, Venmo, RTP, FedNow. You just mentioned social engineering? Are you seeing any influx of the instant payments fraud hit your credit unions and push payment fraud, things like that?
Definitely. Now, in Canada, I will share, we have a bit of a different market because we've had a peer-to-peer email transfer system since the late 1990s, and it's actually a government utility, so it's ubiquitous, and most
Hmm.
people use it. It works absolutely everywhere. But that is, of course, what's under attack most of the time, and that system and our Canadian payment system is being modernized to a real time. So as we move forward towards that reality, it opens up lots more concerns and things that institutions now are asking really good questions. Well, what does this mean to liability? What does it mean to my insurance? Because
Hmm.
now if I have a real-time payment that goes awry, the cost of managing that's going to be a lot higher. The ability to service it's going to be different. And so it leads a whole lot of questions. Now, from the fraud side as well, and that's what they're concerned about, is smaller institutions don't necessarily have the same means to deal with fraud in the same way. So when we open that up, the need to truly have a strong solution is going to be very important, not just to protect the member, but also even the bottom line business, because
Hmm.
there's only so many things you can manage before that trust is gone. So I think, when we look at our e-transfer system is definitely something that nationally it's a conversation because of that. But there are other payment systems that we use. You have your PayPals.
Hmm.
Venmo hasn't taken off quite to the same degree, but we are seeing the growth of those. And right away, naturally people start asking questions. Is this safer than? Like, what's the convenience? So what's going to sway someone from using one of those payments over, say, the national system is going to have to come down to convenience, security, all those kinds of things. So I think that space is going to be very challenged unless you have it all. particularly in Canada. Now, I know in the US it's a bit different because there's a lot of various pieces. And you see some of that, I'd say, in European markets where it's a little more mixed as
Yep.
well. And you've got all of that. But definitely all the same route, which is as payments become instant. And of course, then you get into crypto, which is the other side. Like there's where it's just a wild west. And if you think it's real time presents some of that those challenges, which is you're going to have a higher degree of folks wanting to intercept there because it is real time, and you're going to have a greater degree of probably just a whole lot of noise that isn't there today. So anyway, just some more, again, some of the thoughts, but
Yeah, no, it's great. And it's, there, we're seeing the craziness as well. We almost feel a responsibility that you've got to protect the consumer from themselves in some cases, because
yes.
many times if they get social engineered to send, or a romance scam, and they end up sending an instant payment, real-time payment to a fraudster, and the bank is liable, there's a level of responsibility there that is really mixed. But then there's also the other side of it, which is, on the account takeover fraud
Hmm.
scenario where someone gets into your account and then
Yeah.
instant pays
Yes.
themselves. So we're looking at other ways that we can leverage the mobile application to generate a push notification. Carrie, did you really
Yes.
justify, or did you really send $5,000 to this end destination? And you can immediately say yes or no. So there's different steps that we're taking early on, but we ultimately want to identify if the end destination account is
It's the
something
right
that
one.
is fraudulent, is is high risk, and then take appropriate action. So a lot of work to do there, but exciting time and scary time for sure. Um, so shifting gears a little bit, I assume, and you mentioned this earlier, many of your credit unions are also card issuers. We see a huge difference with our customers in the U.S. who demand a frictionless experience when they're making card not present payments, versus what we have in Europe and South Africa, where there's zero trust, and everything is challenged. And there's regulations around PSD2 and strong customer auth. Can you talk a little bit about the position that your Canadian credit unions take when it comes to step up authentication around payments?
It absolutely. So we in Canada have evolved. I'd say from especially when you're going to a store or retail, whatever. We've evolved from the chip card to tap, and
Hmm.
now to the phone. So basically, everything that exists in it can be done through your phone at anywhere. So that made, I would say, what we saw, particularly over the pandemic, that tapping behavior really increased quite a bit. Because even when we think about physical cards, the ability to be hands off and have that available,
Hmm.
they adapted to it very quickly. So what we've seen is a big shift into contactless, moving to more of our transactions. So that leads us to the device. So the devices are becoming much more ubiquitous. And the funny part is, and I experienced this myself, often the tap capability in the device works better than on the actual card itself. So you can even see that moving more towards people are getting much more used to it.
Hmm.
However, guess what? That's where we're going to see some challenges. What if somebody gets into your device? What if you've got a biometric set up for
Hmm.
all of those transactions now and they can get into your wallet? There's a lot of there, I think we are not quite there yet in seeing it, I'd say, fully blown, but the questions about how we're authenticating and how much that's going to stand up, especially when we do get to real time. And what does identification look like? Will it be token based? Will
Hmm.
it be, there's a lot of those questions, particularly as Canada goes to open banking, which then is going to move it from, we'll say, this tap behavior to we're just going to start moving APIs and calls this way. How do you authenticate against that? And that's your trustless environment. So I'd say we're wedged in between right now. We have a lot of behavior moving there, but we're still architected not quite there. But once that starts to move, we're going to end up with a lot. And so those regulations that you're talking about, we're seeing those, a lot of new privacy legislation,
Hmm.
adopting a lot of our own, Canadian approach. But the other thing we also have to be mindful of is how that relates to our biggest trading partner, the US. So it doesn't, it's not to our advantage to do anything too far off when that could create a lot of economic challenges when you're trying to do business as well. So there's a lot there to consider in the
Yep.
payment space.
Yeah, so you talk about the paying with the device and tapping with the phone, and I'm curious about in a true cardless e-commerce situation. 3D Secure, very prominent in Europe with our customers over there. Not as much uptick in the
Mhm.
US. Is there what's the state of 3D Secure across Canada and amongst your credit unions?
That's a discussion that's just started to be had mainly around the card space, I will
Mhm.
say, and in fraud monitoring. And we have some fraud monitoring tools. And I think the challenge for a lot of financial institutions is these are a lot, we need a lot of layers of tools, but they can be very, very costly. So they need to make, they tend to do this. This is very typical. It's a small market in Canada. So it usually takes one or two to kind of prove it out in the system itself. Because the Canadian system, with some of its uniquenesses, people are like, well, it's got to work in Canada before I'll try it out. And so, there's merit to that in some degree. But at the same token, I think that's where a lot of the institutions now are starting to go, okay, maybe what I've been running right now is good enough for today. But where do we go from here? And then with, like you say, the rise of new tools and new threats, we are starting to see more inquiry into other tools in the market like that. So
Great. Well, I think this project that we're working on together is going to be great. I'm sure that we're going to share the findings with everyone. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I think, it's funny. It's an interesting space because it matters so much, right? Like when we think about what we do. And the basis of banking is the idea of trust, right? When you go, I'm handing you my money so that you can take care of it. So I look at what we're doing here is really reimagining in a digital way the basics all over again. So yeah, so to me that's kind of a really cool motivation. I hope that folks who are thinking about this, you know, kind of move past the fear and look at the opportunities that a really great secure environment is going to lend itself to. So yeah.
Love it. Great. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining me, and thanks to everyone who joined and watched, and excited to share all the findings from this project that we're working on together. So thank you
Wonderful.
very much.
Thank you and
All
have a
right.
great one, everybody. Take care.